You mentioned Iran. I want to talk about the pressure on Iran because the U.S. Air Force says that B-52 bombers have been deployed to the Middle East as a message to Iran. This comes as the U.S. announced it's no longer extending waivers to countries doing any business with Iran. 8 countries now losing that opportunity. Joe, you're out with a new op-ed with former UN Ambassador Mark Wallace on FoxNews.com titled this: Trump should toughen sanctions on Iran. In it, you write, to truly achieve maximum pressure on the regime, President Trump needs to make his sanctions airtight across Iran's economy. This means plugging the sanctions gaps on the other critical pillar of Iran's energy export-dependent economy, petrochemicals. Tell us more.
Okay, so the main point of the op-ed on the Fox News website, but also generally our feeling, and United Against Nuclear Iran, thank you to the Trump administration. Thanks to President Trump. He had the guts to take us out of a bad nuclear agreement with Iran. That's the beginning. Big change. Second, he imposed sanctions on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Also big change, and increased those sanctions. Iran is hurting, so it's begun to threaten us. And I appreciate very much that the president has basically said, with action, sending American military forces over to the region, don't think you're going to strike at us and not have us strike back at you. So now you've got the Iranian government in the last few days saying, one, President Rouhani of Iran says, this is going to be tough on our people. It's going to be like the Iran-Iraq war of the 80s when conditions were miserable in Iran.
Wow.
And that shows you how seriously we're hurting them. The Iranian government really has a choice. Either they're going to come back to the table and negotiate a good nuclear agreement and stop supporting terrorism, or I think they're going to face an uprising by their own people and the possibility of a regime change. And in my opinion, that would be the best of all.
So where do we go now? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is on his way there now, making a stop in Brussels to talk about this threat from Iran. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think we've got to hold tough, and we are holding tough. And the Iranians are on the defensive. Our European allies, the Russians, the Chinese, who signed that Iran nuclear agreement, are complaining that we've come out of it. But I think in this one with Iran, we've got the, you might say, the momentum on our side. This is not going to be easy. It's not without risk. But we've changed the reality on the ground, and I think we've just got to stick with where we are. The Russians will always, we've got to understand, try to take advantage of every situation to our detriment. They are not our allies.
Yeah.
And that's why I think Secretary Pompeo's talks directly with President Putin coming up in the next couple of days are really important.
Well, what should be said during that meeting with Putin?
Well, I think, and I have enough confidence in Mike Pompeo to believe that he will say this, to say that we have decided that that Iran nuclear agreement is dead. And nobody's going to bring it back, and that the Iranians are our enemy. They're supporters of terrorism. They're supporting aggression throughout the Middle East, and they're threatening us long term. That Russia better understand that we've decided this is a priority national interest. In my opinion, it's the most significant threat. Iran constitutes the most significant threat to the U.S. that there is in the world, and therefore, really to basically say to President Putin, stay out of this. Now, he's too often come into it in a calculating way to keep Iran going. But
apparently he even came into it on Venezuela, right? I mean,
he did way out of his part of the world.
Exactly.
Incidentally, there is a story today, and it's alarming, but it's to be expected, that some oil tankers, 2 of which are owned by Saudi Arabia, were victims of sabotage over the weekend. And although the Iranians have put out a diversionary statement, it's pretty clear that they're suspect number 1. We're in a major conflict in the Middle East between Iran on one side and our allies, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, etc., and Israel, on the other side, and we got to stick with our allies against our enemies.
Do we have a coalition on any of these stuff? I mean, when you look at the rest of the world, our partners in Europe, for example, do they get the Iran threat? And what about the China threat? Because I know that when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo came back from Poland a couple of months ago, he was trying to explain to the European countries, our friends, not to use Huawei Telecom. They've already paid for it. They've already, you know, put Huawei infrastructure in place. But Pompeo was basically saying, look, if you have Huawei Telecom, we'll need to share less with you. We will not be sharing as much information. So do we have the coalition across the world? It's
not the same as it used to be. It's not the same as it was, let's say, in the Cold War with Russia, when we were clearly on the side of the Europeans, and we were on the same side, the Western Europeans. Part of it is that China is intertwined with the world economy in a way that the Soviet Union never was. If I'm not mistaken, China actually does more trade with the European Union than it does with us today. And therefore, we got to stand tough with our allies and to say to them, basically, you can't always do what may bring you a few more euros. This is our security on the line, and we got to stand together. So far, we've had an effect on their relations, the Europeans' relations with China. But they're basically trying to walk a narrow line in some ways between us and China while still being closer to us.
Right.
And that's one of the great tests. That's why the strength and persistence of the Trump administration, including Secretary Pompeo, John Bolton, is going to be really important in the months ahead.
Well, this is the test. We're going to be facing another test right here, as the Chinese have announced that they will increase tariffs on $60 billion worth of goods beginning June 1. Senator, it's good to see you.
You too, Maria.
Thank you so much. Joe Lieberman joining us on all of that.